Welcome to Tales of Abundance. Let's travel back to 1607, 419 years ago. We're in Jamestown, Virginia, and 104 settlers step off 3 ships. They have a deal. They work for a company back in England called the Virginia Company. And the agreement that they've all signed is that everyone works together. All food, all labor goes into the common storehouse. Nobody owns anything. By the winter of 1609, 500 people lived in Jamestown. By the next spring, 60 were still alive. 88% of them died in one winter. 13 years later, Plymouth colony is established by 102 settlers on the Mayflower. Same deal, common storehouse, shared labor, no private ownership. They called it the Common Course. Now theirs was more religious. The other was a corporation. But the first winter, 44 died, starved to death. 3 years later, people were still starving. Finally, in both cases, they made a decision. Governor Bradford with the Plymouth colonies, John Smith with Jamestown, they gave people their own land to work, their own land to keep. And what was happening previous in both cases, you can probably guess. People were saying, well, I work harder than John, or Anthony does this, or this person doesn't do that. Women were like, I have to take care of the kids. After they got their own land, the exact opposite. People worked harder. The women that previously didn't want to work because they were home taking care of the kids were taking the kids to the fields with them. And all of a sudden they started flourishing. And that is, in a lot of ways, the founding of America. We started out, nobody really talks about this, but we started out as a socialist experiment in 2 different ways. And it ended the same way that socialism has always worked throughout history. And so what are the lessons, John, Anthony, what are the lessons that we should learn from this?
Good, Joe.
Over 20,000 years of sociology that I've read about, I have not seen where socialism has ever worked as an experiment. Going back to the earliest, groups, tribes of 150 people that were nomadic, when somebody wasn't producing, sometimes they were excused from the tribe to go find a different tribe, and sometimes they were just kicked out and killed. And so, while inhumane and unacceptable in today's world, I think, generally speaking, there's been societies that understand that productivity matters, and I think I would say that even the biology of the body is meant to work. And so I think sociology is nice on paper, or I'm sorry, socialism is nice on paper. I think communism is nice on paper, but I think it's been a failed experiment in most cases for all the reasons you just talked about, is that people want to control somebody else or expect someone else to provide for them versus taking care of themselves. And I've got a bias toward that myself, so I recognize that bias, but but I do think that, having community and taking care of one another as a choice is an important part of community as well. And that often gets missed in kind of an unchecked capitalism, which I think can be just as dangerous as like a purely socialistic environment. So I think there's, like we're seeing today, the polar ends of things can be problematic, and having a balance or moderation. I've got a little sign on my desk that says moderation in all things, including moderation, Oscar Wilde. So.
Yeah, I'll defend the Jamestown and Plymouth folks from the perspective of, I don't know what choice they had when they crossed the ocean. They were escaping, if you will, a totalitarian government that, in the case of the Plymouth folks, their religion was being suppressed and repressed and oppressed. And so they were, as they crossed over, it looked good. It looked like a good idea. And John, it's interesting you said something about, tribes in the past, what they did when someone didn't contribute. Had that been in place in these instances, would there have been a different result? And if that were in place now, would we have a different result? In other words, if someone doesn't contribute equally to the cause, how could we cast them aside? Do we put them on the street and have them fend for themselves? Things like that. So it didn't work, but what else were they going to do at the time? I mean, you're talking about 100 people coming to a land that they had no idea what was here, what the land would reap, what they were going to see when they got here. They saw some good things. They had some difficulties. Hell, their weather was very different than the weather that they left, especially in Massachusetts at the time. So it's not surprising that they struggled as much as they did. I feel for them. I understand what they were up against. But eventually, as you said, they found not so much a solution, but another way to go about it, which got them to start advancing one step at a time. There were still tremendous struggles during that time. This was, this was a brutal journey for these folks, and then the folks that followed along. So
Yeah, I think it's right. It was the same people, same land, same tools. But what changed was ownership, or more importantly, the ownership changed the incentives. If we really want to get down to first principles, it changed the incentives, made people work harder. And, people came here to be part of this collective, which seemed nice. And then what it really turned America into was a place of rugged individualism, freedom, and an opportunity to chase success and an opportunity to be free. So, Anthony, let's do a jump. We're going to go from the early 1600s to 1776. It's the 250th year anniversary of the country. So, this culture kind of stayed through. And I want you to talk a little bit about the founding fathers and what, how they set up a country once it really became officially a country in 1776.
well, you can't ignore the fact that 100 years later they were still under the thumb of the crown in a lot of ways. So despite owning their own land and producing their own products and produce and what have you, they were still, at the mercy of the crown, right? They were sending things back to the crown. They were still bending the knee. And along came a group of men who said, well, wait a minute. What are we getting for all this? What's our ROI on bending the knee to the crown? And they decided that they were going to lay their lives on the line, literally lay their lives on the line to extract themselves from the control of the English crown. And the I'll call them politicians, but the power brokers that the king sent into the colonies to set up governments, to control commerce, to keep their thumb, on the population. So the founding fathers had a completely different view of the world. And this is the birth of self-determination, true self-determination. They, in their writings, not just in the Constitution, most believed, not all, there was arguments here, most believed that the central government should have very, very few powers. And I won't get the history right, but the powers that it should have is, to protect the borders, some level of taxation, very few powers. And the power to the people was pushed through the states. So not only did they believe in self-determination, the right to pursue happiness, not necessarily to be happy, freedom of speech, the freedom to carry firearms and to protect yourself, all those inalienable rights. But they wanted to do it not in a central government per se, but they wanted people in each state, which they viewed as individual communities, different communities. Georgia was different than Massachusetts, was different than Pennsylvania. There were agrarian economies, there were fishing economies, there were cattle raising economies, there were manufacturing started to become a significant economy, especially in New Hampshire and the New England states, textiles and so on and so forth. So they saw the differences in people and wanted those people to self-govern. And that's the essential core of where they were. Now, we can have a conversation about where we are. I'm not going to bring the conversation down, but that was their tenet, self-determination at a local level. And by the way, risk your life. The license plate in New Hampshire still reads "Live free or die." So it's sobering if you step back from this and get rid of the vitriol and all the yelling and screaming about it. It is a very sobering time when you stop and think about it.
I went to Philadelphia for one of my last weekends. I was living part-time in New York, and we went for a weekend to kind of visit all the historic sites in Philadelphia, and a couple of things struck me. One was just what people gave up who didn't lose their, like some of the people lost their life, obviously, but there were a lot of people that were very wealthy that lost everything financially, like financial ruin to put the United States on the map as it is today. And the intelligence with which this group of middle-aged men by today's standards, 30s and 40s for most of them, with the 81-year-old Ben Franklin as the elder statesman of the group, the amount of wisdom that they put into documents that would carry forward through, a couple hundred years of things they could never foresee is beyond remarkable. Like, just amazing how forward-looking they were. And, that's why a lot of people say that those documents were divinely inspired, but just an amazing bit of work from a very large group of people that had a hard time coming to consensus, but did an amazing job.
Yeah, they,
Good.
well, Anthony, you mentioned the powers that they had. The Constitution is really, everybody should read it. If you haven't read it in a while, it's a fairly quick read. It's not very long, unlike today's laws. You should go through and read it. But the Constitution outlines that the entire federal government would have 3 departments: state, war, and treasury, plus a postmaster that wasn't exactly, and they literally limited them to 17 specific powers. They were very clear. Here are the 17 things. It was like being able to set the weights and measures of money, which was gold and silver. They did not have the right to like print money like we do today. They had to establish post offices, raise an army for defense, and it could only be funded 2 years at a time. Maintain a navy, right? So that's kind of the same in the 17. Create courts below the Supreme Court, regulate trade, grant patents. And basically, it was 17 very specific powers. And they were very clear in the 10th Amendment that everything else was the power of the state. Like if you really read what they intended, those are the only 17 things that the federal government was supposed to do. And then they created the Bill of Rights, which really put a leash on government, right? Like the Bill of Rights, read the Bill of Rights. There isn't one thing that limits a individual's freedom. It's 10 different things that limit government's reach and gives people freedom.
Exactly. I mean, they shall not is referenced in that Bill of Rights so many times you probably can't count them. The government shall not infringe on your rights, shall not infringe on your right to bear arms. It's specifically telling the government you can't do these things that basically what other governments had done, where most of these settlers had come from. Whether it was England, Germany, the Norwegian countries, mostly Western Europe at the time. But, as time went on, it was also Western, Eastern Europe, at the time, different companies, Czechoslovakia and what have you. So it was really a restrictive document that unfortunately has been, watered down, to say the least, as we sit here today. One thing we skipped over, to show what these people were made of. They were a stock it's like the best Wagyu beef on the planet. I mean, these people were made of stuff that is amazing. And one person in particular, as the government took hold and we began to be an independent country, George Washington at the time had been a general that led the army, through the wars and was a great hero. He became the first president. He was elected unanimously, and he served a second term, and then they wanted him to keep serving, and he refused because he did not want to become a king. He saw the future as clear as bell, and no one really understood it before, but he had amassed a fortune, lost a fortune, and when all was said and done, he said, "No, I'm not going to be your president any longer. I'm going to go back to my farm. I'm going to go do whatever I did before. Someone else needs to step into the breach." And they set term limits right back then. They did that. So it's an amazing thing to turn down when you stop and think about it. I could be king. And he said no. I mean,
That might be the single most consequential decision after those documents were written in the country's history, to be able to And then, it talked about how he turned over power to Adams, then Adams to Jefferson, I think was the way that went. But all and these people, I don't think any of them were really close friends, right? I think it was contentious relationships politically, I think, at the time. And so really powerful to hand power peacefully to a political opponent. And, I talked to some friends that I have in the Washington, D.C. scene, and they talk about, like, even in their lifetime, they would have bitter political rivals that would regularly eat together, and they were considered friends, even if they had very different political points of view. And so I think that's a really impactful and important part of a healthy society, is being able to have discourse with deep disagreement, but still respect for somebody else's point of view. Even if you don't agree with the point of view, respecting it as a point of view that may be different than your own, and, being able to accept that someone holds that point of view.
And then agreeing to go along with the majority. In terms of the words that are in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were argued vehemently by a number of all of these folks, all of them. Eventually, they agreed, and other people compromised on many of them, right? There was a faction, one of the mistakes of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights has to obviously do with slavery. And there was a ton of debate about that. Let's eliminate it now, was the discussion. Well, the 3/5 clause is in that document. So there was tremendous compromise with these men and women, and they moved on. They didn't shoot each other for the most part. They moved on, and then they continued to work in government to foster and create, the Supreme Court and the Treasury Department and all these other things that have come about in concert with each other, with a lot of debate, which I think is just, wow, what a lesson that we're not.
Anthony, I want to go back to your old hometown. Tell us about the Boston Tea Party, right? You grew up in Boston, and this is a little bit, a couple of years before your time, but what they were willing to do there.
Yeah, I was in grade school. I mean, at the end of the day, it was like it became, the Crown decided to stick a thorn in the side of, the population in Massachusetts and elsewhere, basically imposing a sales tax. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because, and the phrase taxation without representation, became the rallying cry. And primarily it happened because they weren't getting anything for the tax. They were just, it was like they were tithing to a church. And that's exactly what they ran away from when they came here. They wanted self-determination. They wanted to work these things out on their own, and they were willing to suffer to do it. If it meant plowing their fields day and night with, not the greatest tools in the world, and enduring brutal winters and stockpiling whatever they stockpiled to get through the winter. And then to have someone come along and say, we're going to tax your tea, whatever it was, 10%, the equivalent of 10%. I forget the exact number. It didn't matter. It was the principle of the thing. And that's it at its core, the principle of the thing. That's what mattered to them. It wouldn't have mattered if it was a 1/10 of a cent tax. It was the principle of the thing that drove them to dump the equivalent of several thousand pounds of tea into the harbor, and rally in their churches and their communities and say, we're not going to tolerate this, knowing full well that there were soldiers in and among them that were going to get word back to the Crown and get orders from the Crown to, extract the funds anyway. So they knew exactly what was coming, and they weren't afraid to deal with it.
Yeah, Anthony, the 92,000 pounds of tea worth about 1.7 million today, right? And I think you put it well when you say a sales tax, but it was a sales tax on tea. Like, it wasn't even a sales tax on everything. And earlier when you said the Constitution, like, I think it needs to be clear. I don't think most people understand this. There was no income tax. There was no, like we really didn't have any taxes back then on a federal level, other than tariffs, right? And we've had a lot of hubbub about tariffs in the last few years. Well, tariffs were a tax, and they understood that, but there were no income taxes or sales taxes, or none of that stuff existed. Now, some states had some property tax, And most states had poll taxes where everybody today wants everybody to vote. You had to be older. You had to pay a poll tax in most states. In a lot of states, you had to own property and pay a property tax. But
Yeah, you had to be a white man
and
to
so
vote.
yeah. So anyway, they had a little different, view. So John, pursuit of happiness. Again, today everybody thinks they have a right to be happy. The founding fathers talked a lot about a pursuit of happiness. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think people confuse that all the time, right? Is like the pursuit of happiness means you have the right for the pursuit, not the right for that. And I talk all the time about happiness generally is found in people as a byproduct of a life well lived, and the pursuit of that freedom is something we have here that is very different than you find in other countries. And there are people all over the world even today that want to come to America for precisely that. And I remember a trip where I was in Europe and talking to someone in a field of trade, and they were in the same field of trade as many generations before them. I met someone in my most recent trip to Europe where I think it was the fifth or sixth generation inside the family business, and it was predetermined, what they were going to be doing. And it's very hard in those couple of conversations I learned for people to change their station. And in the US, it's very possible to change your station. I mean, you think about, people that start businesses and build, huge businesses and change their economic position. It's certainly easier, I think, for people that have it, they're born into a rich family to have kind of won that lottery and have more opportunity. That's sure. But the number of people who are immigrants that come in and build really interesting lives for their children and their children's children, the story gets told over and over and over again. And that's just not a common thing in other places. And that goes back to, this idea that we are a country built on the freedom to pursue those.
Yeah, I
It
think
wasn't easy, and it wasn't equal. The outcomes weren't equal. What was equal was the right to do it. There were merchants. There'd be two silver merchants on the same street in the north end of Boston. One turned into Paul Revere, who was wealthy and became famous. And maybe down the street, there was another silver merchant who, probably made a living, but he wasn't famous and he wasn't rich. It doesn't mean that he could go up the street and take Paul Revere's wealth and move it down the street to him or her. He just had to change his business model, work a little bit differently, and so forth. They then and now have the right to pursue whatever they want to pursue. The road there might be a little more difficult for one person versus another. Some people might have a leg up at the beginning. Maybe they're capitalized because of some family wealth and so forth and so on, but doesn't eliminate the fact that you can take that first step. We've talked about this to a blue in the face, but I think that's from the very beginning, whether it's Jamestown, Plymouth, the Revolutionary War, it wasn't necessarily easy, and it wasn't necessarily fair, and the outcomes were definitely disparate.
well
A good
but
friend who said exactly that, Anthony. He said, you can start with equal starting lines or equal finish lines. The first is more capitalism, the second is more socialism, but you can't have both.
and Anthony, your silver example or silver merchant example is a great one, right? But that's all they asked for was the equal opportunity. Paul Revere and the guy down the street, they both started with the same opportunity. And maybe one of them started ahead, or who knows, I don't know their background, their education, or whatever else. But the thing that always kind of jumps out to me, if you read also like the Declaration of Independence, nowhere in it did they say, King George, you have to give us blank. They weren't asking for freebies or handouts. They said, stop doing things to us, leave us alone, and let us pursue our happiness. John, let's jump forward 250 years to today. Let's talk about how things are different today than where we left them 250 years ago at the founding fathers.
Yeah, and I mean, without being political, I think you can have an intellectually honest conversation that starts with the facts, right? I think the facts are the founding fathers didn't see themselves as career-long politicians, and they didn't see politics as a career. They saw it as a community service that they did in addition to the other work they were doing, and it was going to be time boxed. And then they would move back to the work they were doing. And that was a great way to keep people grounded in what was happening. And there are all kinds of problems we could point to around, like, it was white men who were landowners as the people. And yes, I think we all agree that there's some flaws in the way the system came from in that perspective. But today we do have career politicians that sometimes aren't fully connected to the people they're representing, which I think is, perhaps problematic. I think having career politicians, I think the stat that I saw was more than half of the people in Congress are millionaires. And it strikes me that they don't have the same healthcare system that they've regulated other people into. Those are some of the disconnects that I see, and so it's different. They don't have the same rules for trading inside the stock market, which I think is problematic. Where it's legal for people in Congress to be insider traders, which is clearly outlawed for anybody else. And even Martha Stewart went to jail for it, right? And so so I think that there's some disconnects that I think we should just be intellectually honest about and ask ourselves if that's the way that we want our system working. So, you have
Yeah.
a system of things like I think the Rural Electric Commission gets like $500 million a year. It was funded for rural electricity. We've had rural electricity in the US for decades now, and now that money still goes to that commission and now gets used for other things that I don't know. Maybe they're very valuable things. I don't know much about that particular thing, but I think we have to be willing to sunset different departments that come in for a period of time, and we don't tend to do that. And so I think this is back to what Charlie Munger said about follow the money and I'll show you the incentives.
Yeah, I think you're wrong about one thing. When you said they don't represent the people, they actually do, except it's a very small group of people. It's not the populace. It's a small group of people that fund their campaigns. That's who they're answering to. So we jumped over 250 years pretty quickly. And how did we get here? During that time, a lot of things transpired, but the consolidation of wealth and power over the last 250 years has manifested itself into what we have today. So we use capitalism as kind of the overarching piece of it. Capitalism is just a word. The economics of the day is what drives things. And the 1800s had its economic profile, good and bad, right? The Industrial Revolution resulted in great innovation and magnificent advances in productivity. And for a significant period of time during the 1800s, the national average of income rose along with productivity equally, and the middle class emerged. There was a 50-year period, the early 1900s, when we start to get taxation. We start to get, kind of toying around with the money supply. We have world wars, that resulted in insane debt in the country two times. You have the outcome, not the outcome, the creation of the military industrial complex with its own motivations. War is good for us. The heck with the, 18-year-olds that we're sending into battle, whether it's 1, 2, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, so on and so forth. So this consolidation of power around wealth is got us I won't say on the brink, but it's got us in a place that's going to be very difficult to unwind. How are we ever going to get back to the time when in 1778, 100% of the people that were entitled to vote would vote, right? There was no real restriction on the people they decided. But even then, it wasn't 100% of the people. Women couldn't vote. You could vote if you were African American, but you had to pay a poll tax, which you probably didn't have. So that was their way of restricting that stuff. But
Anthony, I want to bring you back forward. I want to bring you back forward to today. We're trying to focus on today here. So what's your takeaway on this, on today versus 250 years ago?
I'm telling you what my takeaway is. We've got a consolidation of power that it's going to be very, very difficult to extract ourselves from. Without term limits, and you think Congress is going to vote for term limits? You're dreaming. So,
it would take a lot of George Washingtons, wouldn't it? Or it would take a constitutional Congress, which would be really hard.
Yeah.
The thing I would add to, I think you're right about they're talking to their donors, but the other group of people they're talking to, I would also argue, are the stupid people. And this is not to offend people, but it might, but that's okay.
Okay.
If you think about
that was fairly offensive, by the way, but go ahead.
You don't know what I'm going to say. You guys have no
Well,
idea
Go
where
ahead.
I'm going. You have no
yeah,
idea where I'm going
yeah,
here. So
Keep
you'll
going.
be
Keep
half
going.
right. You'll be half right.
we have an election. Most people have already decided who they're going to vote for. And there are people that have done all this research. There's other people who have done some research or have strong beliefs, but elections are decided by the people in the middle who haven't made a decision. And by the way, what's the number one way that they convince these people? Through 30-second and 1-minute TV commercials. Okay. I would submit to you that anybody that votes for the president, like, would you hire anybody to work for your company if you just had them give you a 30-second to 1-minute TV commercial and that's how you decided with no other information, that's the person that's going to work for me, right? Your company would not hire.
You've missed you're looking at the whole, not the donut, Randy. The problem with the elections is that the primary system that didn't exist in 1778 and for most of the 1800s
Well,
are
they didn't want,
selecting
by the way, the founding fathers were very against political parties, period.
Right, I
They
understand.
didn't want them.
What I'm saying to you is that the primary system we have today is teeing up who our choices. And in rare instances, the primary candidates have a constituency, a perceived constituency that are going to result in that particular person being elected in that particular state, county, city, and so forth. We don't have full, free and fair elections where there are 10, 15 people on the ballot that can be selected for president or senator or a congressman or a city council person or whatever. So again, who gets the primary slots? The people that can afford the 30-second commercials to get on the ballot as the Democratic or the Republican nominee. That's where the problem, that's the root cause.
I'm not disagreeing with any of that, but at the end of the day, the people in the middle decide the elections because there's a certain number of people that are going to vote R, and there's a certain number of people that are going to vote D, and there's people in the middle, and those people do almost no research, right? And they do whatever feels right at the time. And so they're speaking to their donors, but they're also, how can I get votes from those people? By the way, John, to switch topics here or to continue with where you were on this, you know, the size of government you referenced, just I like the numbers. We talked about earlier, the Constitution outlined 3 government departments. There's now over 430 government or federal agencies. Back in 1816, so not going back 250 years, we had 5,000 total federal employees. Today, there's 2.1 million plus the military, plus contractors. And we could go on and on with this, but anyway, it's just there's, you know, it's unbelievable. And, you know, again, Anthony mentioned the money. There was no income tax until 1913 when we went off the gold standard and started printing money and everything else as well. So,
you know, back to the elections, you know, I think yes, people do whatever research they're going to do, a lot, a little, none. But when they go to the poll, whether it's a primary or a general election, they're punching their ballot, they're flicking the machine based on their self-interest, their perceived self-interest at the time, given what they know.
and how
At
did
the
they
end of
make
the
that
day,
decision?
that's what they're doing. Nobody, if there was a ballot measure that said, punch this ballot and you will be enrolled and drafted into the United States Army to put your life on the line against this 438 men and women in Congress, because we want to have a constitutional amendment to have term limits. How many people would do that today? I don't think anybody. You know, there might be some limited number of people. Their self-interest today is defined by economics. It's not defined by freedom. It's not defined by the pursuit of happiness. It's defined by what do they perceive is in their economic best interest. And that is so far away from what was founded 250 years ago. They're not even in the same stratosphere. So anyway, I'm on my high horse and I apologize for it, but well, actually, I'm not apologizing for it. Screw you. I'm on my high horse.
I like it. All right. Even if you're wrong, I like it. No, you're not wrong. I just, you know, I think we're
Randy, I did a quick research just in 1800, there was about 130 federal civilian employees, which represented 0.002% of the US population. Today, 2.1 to 2.7 million employees, 0.6 to 0.8% of the population, not including contractors or military personnel.
So it's a much bigger tax burden and everything else. So, all right, let's talk about, more importantly, how do we benefit ourselves, our family? Like, how do we use this to create abundance in the environment that we live in today? We may not like it. We may not like the elections. I may not like the taxation or the broken money and all that different stuff. But these are the rules of the game, as stated today. So,
Yeah, look, this goes back to what I was saying a minute ago, which is like people still flock from all over the world to come here for our system, which allows for the pursuit of happiness. And, I tell people, I work in the healthcare space, and I tell people in healthcare, like, I think there's a reasonable argument that the healthcare system is broken, but there's still things we can do as individuals to become more healthy inside of a difficult system. And so while our system is not a perfect system and may not ever be a perfect system, there are a lot of opportunities inside of our system. And I would argue more opportunities here than other places. And so, what can we do to find that opportunity? And I think, you can, and there's opportunity abundantly throughout the system in our country. And so find the opportunities that fit with what you do want to do. And yeah, I had a mentor that told me once, like, if you focus on things to complain about, you're going to find things to complain about. If you focus on finding opportunity, you're going to find opportunities. You get what you look for. It's that whole idea that when you buy a purple car, you see purple cars everywhere the next day. And so, my encouragement for people is wherever you want abundance, start looking for it, and you're going to find it here more plentifully than you will other spaces. Not to say you can't find abundance in other countries as well, but I think it's more plentiful here because of the background that we come from back in the 1700s.
Yeah, I think that's a great level one statement. In the spirit of what got us started doing what we're doing here today, and the 5 Fs. I don't think you can create abundance across all 5 of them at one time. I think you've got to, focus. Okay, how am I going to create abundance in my family? How am I going to create abundance in my community? How am I going to create abundance in my fitness? In my finance? Each of the individual 5 Fs, you've got to have a plan for, because they don't all come in one big pile. You don't get a great job and your family and your friends are fixed, and your fitness is fixed. Things are left on the table. In fact, they could be hurt by, taking a tech job that's got 12 hours a day and weekend work and so forth. It could have a negative impact on those other things. So you've got to be conscious of all 5 of those things as you pursue abundance, which, to your point, John, is available to you in this country and in this world, for that matter. Nothing's going to be easy, but nothing is standing in your way. Is that a possible statement? That there are obstacles, sure, but all of them can be overcome. Most can be overcome. Short of disabilities and other things like that. So, yeah, I think you got to focus on all 5 of them.
I think what I heard from John was more about mindset, and I think that fits with, there's 2 real messages that are competing for our attention today. One of them, there's a lot of people, but Mondami seems to be the most, the biggest name right now, and the one that's communicating this one most effectively, whether I like it or not. And that is that the system owes you. You deserve to be happy. You deserve healthcare. You deserve a house. You deserve whatever it is that you want. And we just need to take from these people over here and give to you. The other message is more, again, and by the way, I would argue that is the Jamestown, Plymouth Rock message when they were started, right? Was come here, be a part of this system, and you will just get taken care of. And then I would argue the other is more the Founding Fathers message of, hey, here's an opportunity. Go out, build it, kind of what you're saying, Anthony. It may not be easy, but there is an opportunity, and you can go do this. And I was thinking about this the other day, unrelated to this topic, but I think immigrants to this country appreciate message 2. They come here, not all of them. There's been some problems recently where they come here for message 1, but I think a lot of them come here for message 2. The most successful people, they don't take it for granted the way people in America grow up taking it for granted. And I think maybe they also haven't been brainwashed with message one as much. But I think that that's the big thing. Whichever of the 5 F's people want to work on, if you come in with the attitude of, I'm a victim, somebody else has to do this for me, and the government's going to take care of me, life's going to be freaking hard regardless. And if you come in with the attitude of, hey, I got an opportunity to pursue what I want, there's going to be challenges. I agree with you. It's going to be hard, but you can do it. And I think there's a lot of great immigrants that have done a great, a lot of the big CEOs and people making a difference in our country are not from here.
Right. Yeah, I'm not, yeah, on the surface, this democratic socialist movement of take and give, take from the rich, give to the poor, sounds pretty like not a good idea. But there are elements of the condition that we're in as a country where they're right in some ways. The lack of housing that's occurred in the country, and especially in densely populated areas, is caused by a number of things that, the rank and file don't control, right? So the transportation systems haven't been kept up and are becoming expensive and unreliable in some places. So they have a point in terms of their day-to-day living. And, it's funny, if you think back to when this mass immigration was happening during the Biden administration, and I'm not being political here, I'm going to talk about the actual immigrants. You may recall that there were immigrants who came in who weren't satisfied with the amount of free stuff they were getting. They were complaining about the meals. They were complaining about their access to health care and so on and so forth. And I don't know what happened to those people in terms of where they are today, but it wouldn't surprise me if some percentage of those people said, shoot, I'm not going to count on this government. I'm going to go do something on my own and make something happen. And they broke out of that, give me something for free spiral, because that opportunity did exist for them to get a better meal, a better home, a better hotel, or whatever the case might be. So they're right in some cases. Their overall solution is not going to work, but there are some things that we could do better as a society to alleviate some of the pain that the K-shaped economy is creating.
Well, I think that's the reality of the Buffett amendment that was proposed. Buffett proposed publicly and never really got proposed, which was, if you can't balance the budget as a politician, then you're not available for reelection, not eligible for reelection. And so, back even in the 18th century, 1700s, a Scottish historian said that a democracy can't exist as a permanent form of government, period. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. And then Margaret Thatcher, centuries later, said there's no such thing as public money. There's only taxpayer money. And she constantly made the point that, if you keep taxing people who make money because they start businesses and run businesses, eventually they'll leave your country. And then the government won't stop spending. Somebody else has to pay, and that somebody else is you, right? We always run out of other people's money. And that's the problem.
Yeah, and then you layer that with what we're discovering, which we've known this all along, but the magnitude of the waste is just confounding the problem. This is not a spending problem. We have the money to spend. We're just so inefficient in our spend, and you can do the NGO thing, you can do $24 billion 1 mile tracks in California, and hundreds of, $30 billion on the homelessness that results in more homelessness. You go down the list. And so you step back from that and you say, oh, no wonder people are feeling they're at the bottom of the K-shaped economy, because the money's not getting to me. The help's not getting to me. Look at the Veterans Administration. It's better today, but for 30 years, it was the worst healthcare system on the planet. And we had supposed great politicians that were trumpeting veterans' rights and so forth. But from the 80s through the early 2000s, it was, do your research on that. It's where people went to die, not to get well. It was it was like institutional. It was so bad.
People would say we're still there with the VA, but I think
it's not. Yeah, yes, there's still plenty of improvement. Anything government run, can be 10% better for 10% less starting tomorrow. I agree with that. But man, we have had abject failures across the board. The government waste in defense, picking the wrong weapon systems. It goes on and on and on. So you can understand why people are saying, hey, you know.
But at the same time, Anthony, back to abundance, it's like in the middle of all of that, in 2017, you and I bought a business, took it from a little business to a much bigger business, and funded an entire family's retirement in a 10-year period. Like that exists, right? Like that opportunity exists. I think, there's so many opportunities in the US, and I think technology is making it so that opportunities are more democratizable and less expensive to get into. What used to cost, $1 million to stand up a business today costs less than $100,000, maybe less than $10,000 in some cases. So I think that, for someone who is upset about all these things at the system level has every right to be upset, and abundance exists today in ways I think it didn't even 20 years ago. Much more democratized, much more available, much more cost effective to start and run a business, much more available to have control of your financial future in the short term. Despite the fact the system is still broken and maybe breaking. Like I don't discount that, but I think it's about like, what do you control? And there's a lot of opportunity we have. And despite the fact that taxes are different and all those other things, like I still think that today is the best opportunity that I've seen in my lifetime, in a lot of ways. Not maybe from the cost of capital, maybe not from the frothiness of the market, but there are other things like, the ability to code technology, not being a technologist, and the ability to have access into markets you couldn't before. Like I think those things are better. So again, I think it's what you focus on. I choose to focus on the positive, acknowledge what's not so positive, and then try to make a difference, but also acknowledge how you can move forward without being paralyzed.
We got to move, fellas. We got to move to our last.
I got one more thing. I'm not going to let this go, because I do think we're ripe for success in this sense. Call it the people that don't have the philosophy degree from ABC University, but may be very happy with a working class job, which sounds derisive, but it's not meant to be. There are literally millions of welder, construction jobs in the like that don't require a degree, just require skill. And, those jobs are going to go to people who are willing to work and work hard. And we could have a divide here where the K changes, but the demographic of the K changes. Because, let's face it, who's building your house today? Who's, working at the side of the road? Who's in the factories? Not the kid with the philosophy degree, right? And so there are literally, Randy and I looked this up last week. There's like 7 million open jobs right now in this country. Very few of them require a degree.
By the way, I could go for hours on like 3 or 4 different topics here, but we got to move to the. I have a lot of opinions on democracy and the money and a lot of other things that were mentioned and incentives. But let's move to Anthony. You'd ask a question in advance. Where will we be in 250 years? This is the 250-year anniversary. I think we just generally make that, where are we going in the future? Because I think it's really hard to look 250 years in the future. But you asked the question, so you answer it. Where do you see it? Where do you see this thing going?
Well, it's not a good question because it's unanswerable. The way things are moving right now, 250 hours is more like the time frame that things are changing. Literally, you go from, Claude whatever to Fable whatever to, curing cancer and vaccines, and all this is just happening so fast. But I think we're going to be in an abundant society for people who want abundance in their 5 Fs. It's got to be more and more available to people, not less. So that's how I'm going to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've heard it said that, democracies can't last, 250, 300 years. And you look at the rise and fall of Rome, I think there's going to be kind of some reckoning that hopefully we come out better on the other side and prove that wrong, is my hope for what happens. And my hope is that we, continue to give people opportunities where we have a level a starting line as people would like to see happen. I think that'd be a great thing. And so that's my hope for what happens in kind of the near and long term future, and what I hope for my kids and my kids' kids.
All right. The democracy thing, by the way, I know this is going to hurt people's ears, but America was never intended to be a democracy. In fact, one of the things that we didn't talk about in the 250 years ago, the founding fathers were really, really, really clear. They hated democracy. They knew democracy wouldn't work. And the basic concept is if you have two foxes and a chicken in a democracy, you know what's for dinner. And we've got to figure out how to get back to a republic or fix this. But at the same time, we are so blessed to be living in a place where we have AI, robotics. I mean, the things I'm doing right now with AI, I mean, I'm creating a product that literally 2 weeks ago I could not have created. And I could only create it with like the newest AI. And robotics are coming and all these different things. We have flying cars. I mean, the future is here. I mean, there are spacecraft. I mean, SpaceX is launching multiple times a month and they're reusing rockets. And there's multiple companies now that are putting data centers in space. There's multiple, people trying to mine the moon and mine asteroids. And all of that is going to make a better world. And I just think right now it's a little rough for some people, but there is so much opportunity if you just lean into, you know, the right things and train yourself. And like you said earlier, John, in a way it's it's never been easier, but I also think the message that's out there has made it much harder because people think that it's supposed to be given to them in so many cases, and they've bought this story. So,
Yeah.
you know,
The one liner you have in our notes is, the pursuit of happiness isn't a promise, it's an invitation. I just
love that.
love that. I love that statement. So I'll leave
Let's
it there.
let's go to break right there. Listeners, download, subscribe, tell your friends, and we will talk to you after the break with the abundance.
Here are tales of abundance. We know that fitness is just as important as money or milestones. It's one of our key 5 F's. For lots of us, taking care of my body while I build my life is one of the more time-consuming and difficult goals to chase. That's why we're partnering with AG1. It's a daily drinkable habit. Less than a minute, that's formulated with 75 plus vitamins and nutrients and designed to support energy, digestion, and immune defense. It even has a few grams of protein that we're all chasing these days. And if you want to try it with our affiliate link, you'll also receive a free AG1 flavor sampler, plus vitamin D3 plus K2 with your welcome kit when you first subscribe, a $72 value. Go to shop.drinkag1.com/tales.
Welcome back for the abundance briefing. John, Anthony, our first story out of Dallas is the Texas Stock Exchange. I don't hear anybody talking about this, but this thing launched trading July 6th. So by the time you listen to this, it'll be out more than a week. It's going to be much more digital, a direct competitor to Wall Street. And by the way, this is being backed by BlackRock, Citadel, Chase Bank. I mean, the big boys are here. Chase now has more employees in Texas than they have in New York by like 2 to 1. And it used to be more skewed the other way. Goldman Sachs has built a new building next to this, like a huge building, bigger than what they have in Wall Street. And that thing's going. I mean, I think this is a big story, mostly about what it means and, where it's going. But what are your thoughts on this? John, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's super interesting. I mean, I'm not. The ringer came in. I don't know if you mentioned Dell coming in and being listed on the Texas Stock Exchange is one of those things. And so, what you're seeing is a movement from kind of, I think, tax efficient, business efficient places from a tax and rule of law perspective into places that are business friendly. And I saw some things online even over the weekend where there was questions about Dell doing this, for example, where they're moving away from Delaware's court of chancery to an untested court in Texas, but it was worth it for them. And so I think that says a lot about the trust in the legal environment and the tax environment. And I mean, and I think Delaware's got a fairly good tax environment for most corporations, as an example. And even Jamie Dimon was talking about that movement from New York into Texas. And he says there's still great people coming to New York, but Texas as the current placeholder is drawing a lot of people in economically, and we're going to see a lot of economic growth as a result of that.
Anthony, I'm going to ask you a little different question. How do you think this, think this through? I guess I'm asking you game theory a little bit. What is this going to do to New York? Not today, not
Well,
tomorrow. Where's this going?
it could be faster than you think. Capital chases efficiency, and the Texas Stock Exchange has positioned itself lower cost, less friction for public companies, more competition in trading. They want to, Texas obviously is really, really working hard to become a financial hub and a corporate headquarters state. And they're appealing to people that aren't happy with the way things work on the New York Stock Exchange. What I'm surprised by, one thing I am surprised by, is it's not a 24/7 stock exchange. I thought that would be one of the components of it, but it's not. At least not yet. I mean, you can still trade futures 24 hours a day and things like that as you can on the stock exchange. But we'll see what in the long 10 years from now. Who knows? I mean, it's not going to be an overnight thing, but competition is great. That's what I think.
Yeah, your thing that it could be faster. New York is talking about all these crazy new tax. It's already a high tax state. How many people don't want to go to a lower tax state? And then if they incorporate more, it only speeds that up. And I think this is there's New York, like the California money, a lot of it flows to Texas. The New York money, a lot of it flows to Florida and some of it to Texas, but this could give Texas a really competitive advantage there. So let's move to our next topic. Solar powered desalination is now cheaper than bottled water. Now, we're always skeptical when this stuff's out of China, but from the China's Academy of Sciences and Shenzhen University, they built a solar desalination device that produces drinking water with zero grid electricity. And basically, they've got little solar panels that throw out clean water. What is it? A 0.75 square meter outdoor prototype produced over 20 liters, which is more than 5 gallons of clean water a day. So I think this is pretty cool. I know, John, you're excited about this one.
Yeah, super. By the way, commercially bottled water is pretty expensive, so that maybe, but it's a great start. And so 5 gallons a day with solar panels, it's pretty amazing. And then you think about what's happening with kind of the salt batteries that you've seen some of the news around lately, and how you might combine those couple of things to solve both an energy and an energy storage problem with kind of not as much environmental damage. Like, I think these two things coming together could mean a lot. So you have clean water, you have a use of the byproducts for storage. I mean, I'm really excited to track this story over time.
Yeah, I'm stunned that we as a universe, with all our engineers across the world, that desalination and improving access to clean water isn't like at the top of every single list on the planet in terms of a problem to solve. We have, desolate parts of Earth that are in desperate need of clean water, clean sanitation, and so forth. And there just doesn't seem to be, the energy behind it in the United States, at least. And I can't speak for Europe and other, but I think the Middle East is also a leader in desalination. I know it has its downside in terms of the environmental impact around the coastlines and things like that. But Jesus, you can't live without water. You can live without a lot of things, but you cannot live without water. So it confuses me that this isn't like a number one thing. So
Well, there's a lot of people. I mean, we know some people, all of us, that are, contributing to digging wells in Africa because there's lots of people that have to walk miles and miles to get water. And this seems to me that if they can prove this out, sending those resources toward building something like this is even better than digging a well, right? And probably much cleaner, purer water. So I think this is really cool. But the roadblock here, just as it is with AI and almost everything, it always comes back to energy. You got it. So the solar power is the key, and I'm hoping AI is going to make solar better, and we can fix fusion or fission or whatever other energy sources it can create. And when it does that, the cheaper energy becomes and the more abundant energy becomes, the easier things like this. I don't think desalination is a tricky thing scientifically. It's another way that we have to use energy, and why energy is so important in every thing. So moving to the next topic, that takes us to the next topic. America hadn't deployed we've just not been deploying nuclear reactors, but the first small modular reactor has been greenlit. And, this is the Tennessee Valley Authority is putting this thing forward. And I hear all kinds of stories of all these little mini nuclear reactors, right, that can go and, power smaller places or data centers. I think this is really effective, whether it's the last topic of desalination or, whatever it's moving toward. This can really help lead us toward energy abundance.
Yeah, the nuclear energy was the data center boogeyman in the 80s. We had power plants all over the world that were producing abundant energy. France, for instance, I can't remember the percent, someone can look it up, but it was well over 50% of their electrical power came from nuclear power. I don't know what the percentage is today, but I know it's a lot less. Germany, the same thing. So here we are, 3 Mile Island closed whenever it closed in the 80s because of, fear mongering. No one died. There was no radioactive leak anywhere. No one got sick, but we shut down a plant that was providing a tremendous amount of power to a good part of Pennsylvania. So I'm glad that we've turned that corner. It's still a ways away. It still has regulatory issues, and the fact that someone has to green light something that could save the world is, just mind-boggling. This should take 15 minutes. You want to build a mini plant to run your 2 square mile data center and have no impact on electrical cost and the environment in Columbus, Ohio, go for it. As a matter of fact, it should be a requirement.
Note to self, Anthony will be on no nuclear reactor approval commission ever.
They solved the waste problem. They solved these problems. Once again, man left alone will solve its problems. Government got in the way of this. It has put us in this position where we're reliant on fossil fuels, which is fine for now, but for the long run, it's not going to meet our needs. We clearly have outstripped the supply. The supply of energy is below what the demand is and will be going forward. And no amount of fossil fuel is going to fill that gap. It can all bubble up to the surface today. It's not going to fill that gap. So get on with it, as I say. Move on.
Randy, I had to look this up, what a small reactor was. I didn't really have an understanding of what that amount of power was. And so it's about the third the size of a traditional reactor. And you could put multiple of these reactors on one nuclear site if you wanted to. That's enough power to power 200 to 250,000 homes per year, full tilt continuously, always on, or the equivalent of about 400,000 horsepower.
Yeah.
So I thought super, super cool to have that type of power, and assuming all the things Anthony just said about the impact and the safety of it and all those things. But it's pretty promising.
Yeah, and what I've heard about these, and I don't know all the details, but that if there ever is some kind of a catastrophe, that they're much, much safer. And oh, by the way, nuclear, even 3 Mile Island, got shut down. I don't think it actually killed anybody, right?
No, it didn't.
And so this is much safer. It's another source. One of the things that's interesting, I was reading recently, the Nixon administration passed a law basically requiring the government to open, it was 100, 200, 500. It was a huge number. John, you might want to fact check the exact number. A huge number of nuclear power plants. And literally from that, they also created the Nuclear Commission to oversee it. Guess how many power plants got created? Zero.
Since then.
Zero. They literally set out, this was a national strategic, this was really important. I think it might have been 100 of them. And zero got created because it just became too hard. Like, even though there was a government mandate, it was just never filled because it was so hard to create them. Did you find a number, John?
We can't build
Looking-
single-family homes because of regulation in this country. You know, and without dragging this is actually a positive. Nuclear runs 24/7. What the power, the supply issue and the demand issue is not at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's at various peak times during the day. So these power plants can run, and as battery storage becomes better and better, which it will, that power can be stored and used during those peak demand periods. So there's a lot of stuff cooking in the energy industry, but we got to get out of our, if anyone's listening from the government, we've got to get out of our own way.
Well, they're listening, or AI is
That's
listening on their behalf. But anyway,
Yeah.
yes.
So anyway,
Yeah, it's, a country's, there's all kinds of studies, countries' economic health, their happiness, a lot of different things are really tied. Nutrition, health, a lot of things are really tied to energy. So if we really want to be pro-human in almost every way of abundance, energy is really one of the biggest things that we got to solve. So,
another example where China is ahead of us.
So yeah, Nixon's Project Independence was originated with the Atomic Energy Commission, and it talked about 1,000 nuclear reactors by the year 2000.
so I was only off by a factor of 10. I said 100, so 1,000. Yeah,
Never came close to happening.
right. And we didn't get them because the Atomic Commission that they also created shut them all down or wouldn't allow them.
Well,
Yeah.
and
Today there's
but
90 commercial reactors today.
But did they? So that was done, John, was that 1973 or so, somewhere around there?
1967 was the first mention of it.
1967. So as they were seeing that OPEC was taking over oil, there was a fear that we were going to be dependent on OPEC and so forth. So they created that commission. That's great.
Well,
And we
this
got
is, John, you talk about who we're getting messages from, right? And, I believe that almost all of that nuclear FUD came from oil companies because they were the ones that they were afraid of getting cut out. Like, there's proof now that, Germany shut down all their nuclear facilities a few years ago. I think they're in the process of opening them back up. But now it's been tracked that all that FUD and the whole bunch of money came from Russia because Russia was selling them oil and natural gas. And I just listened to a podcast a couple weeks ago. There's a guy, super credible guy that, speechwriter, worked for the Treasury, speechwriter of the Senate, worked for Treasury. I'd love to give him credit. I can't remember his name. And they have tracked, just from one person in China, $300 million has flown into the U.S. to fight data centers. Their estimates are that guy has shut down several billion dollars. I don't remember the exact number, but it was the billions of dollars of data center and energy projects across the U.S. And they've tracked just that one guy at 300 million and growing from China, right? So, I think that's your message, John, if we got to be careful where, who is sending the message and what are their incentives. So, all right. Anyway, I think this is great news. Like, it's just until we are, Elon wants solar. This gets us there. We're tiling space, etc. All of that's moving in the right direction to a more abundant future. So, give us all the breakthroughs that we've been talking about. Gentlemen, until next week, listeners, go out and spread a little abundance this week.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and do all the things you do to refer your friends to make sure they listen too.